Hello there, and welcome to our panel, Future Labours, Citizen Sleeper and Hardspace Shipbreaker in Conversation. I am Gareth Damian Martin, the solo developer behind Citizen Sleeper, and I'm here with Elliot, who is the game director on Hardspace Shipbreaker. And this is going to be a conversation about labour and the future, as implied by the title, but also our two video games. And to kick things off, I'm going to surprise you, Elliot. I'm sorry. I did have an idea. Yeah. You can tell me if it's a bad idea. I thought we could start off by, rather than each of us introducing our own game for people who don't know the games, I thought I could introduce your game and you could introduce my game.
Let's do it.
Just for fun.
Yep.
Just to mix things up a little. So, Hardspace Shipbreaker, it's funny, I suggested that, but I haven't actually prepared. Hardspace Shipbreaker is a video game about cutting up huge spaceships in orbit around Earth and working for Lynx Corporation, who are a pretty cruel and large dystopian corporation. And you're trying to pay off your debt, but also kind of manage the labor situation within Lynx with your colleagues and bosses. Meanwhile trying to survive to the next shift, cutting up these kind of terrifying, increasingly vast as you go on spaceships. Would that be an accurate description of?
Very well done. Yeah, okay. Excellent, great work. Now it's on. Now I'm on the spot. So Citizen Sleeper is a game where you play as this android type creature that seems to be infused almost with like a human soul that has escaped from indentured servitude to this large corporation and has ended up on this sort of lonely space station that has this little community built around it. And you learn over time are learning how to be part of this community. You sort of find a job or find different ways to survive, but it's all about building these relationships with people, taking on different tasks and engaging with these systems of capitalism, even within this remote place, and just trying to survive day to day as a stranger in sort of a new land, and try to find kind of your humanity amidst all of that, and nice. Ultimately choose how you want to live in that world.
That sounds great. I want to play. I want to play that game.
I want to play that game that you described.
And I guess the reason that we're here having this panel is because I think both of our games have a kind of resonance, an obvious resonance in the fact that they're both about labor in the future or capitalism or what it means to work. But also I have a little story about how the games are connected, which is that when I was first developing the concept for Citizen Sleeper, and I was about a week out from pitching it, the first trailer for Hardspace Shipbreaker dropped, and at the time in Citizen Sleeper you had a debt and you were trying to pay it off by cutting up spaceships. That was kind of like a core part of the premise. So I immediately shelved the debt
way.
and the more shipbreaking focus, although that kind of still is very much part of the game.
Yep.
And I slightly reoriented things and messed around with my pitch deck and had about 5 days to do that before I had to send it to my publisher.
Oh, Gareth. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, don't be. I was so excited when I saw the trailer. But I was also like, this is terrifying because I'm a solo developer, and this incredible big studio has just come out and stepped right into the zone that I was planning to step into. But
oh my goodness,
I was very excited and immediately bought the game in early access.
Well, thank you.
So I was very happy. But yeah, so I guess the funny flip of that is that a little while ago I was talking to you, Elliot, on Twitter. We've never actually spoken in person before, and you shared with me a early development screenshot of Hardspace Shipbreaker, which looked a hell of a lot like Citizen Sleeper.
100%. Yeah, it was all about being on a ring-like space station, and you would just sort of go to these different locations, and you had action points that you would spend every day on doing various activities and interfacing with lots of different people. And it looks a lot like what Citizen Sleeper ended up looking like. And it's almost interesting. It seems almost as if your game went from like a focus on shipbreaking, and ours went from this sort of like metagame thing, and we almost like transposed positions throughout development, and ours became super focused.
It's really funny. It was so bizarre to me to see
Yeah.
that screenshot, especially after having that experience. And of like seeing Shipbreaker and being like, oh my God, this is like one of my dream video games. And I was making my own dream video game, but someone else is making it. But I'm really curious because of that. Because we're supposed to be talking about kind of labor and capitalism, is like how Shipbreaker kind of began in terms of like looking at that screenshot where you have action points and you're on the station and you're moving around it, that early version of the game. How early on did that kind of labor focus, that focus on kind of working for a corporation, on unions, on what it feels like to work a day job, or manual labor and things like this? At what point was that part of Hardspace?
It wasn't necessarily there from the beginning. I've talked a little bit about the history of Shipbreaker and other places, how it started as a game jam game at Blackbird.
Right,
just for 1 week we did a little game jam game, and it was this game that we made called Hello Collector. And you were just one person sent to really far reaches of space on your own to these wreck sites of spaceships where you would scavenge the like precious resources and materials there. There was no shipbreaking. It was very much just like a scavenger hunt. We got a grapple hook, and it was 0G, and it was very immersive. So there's some qualities that were there that carried through the full product. But it wasn't really focused on labor. Like there was this sort of corporate satire when you were getting these sort of sarcastic messages from the company as you were scavenging. But it wasn't super focused on examining what labor and capitalism meant at the time. But through development, as we sort of layered on more mechanics and thought about what was interesting, what we really wanted to explore with this game, and trying to add more meaning to it, we sort of hit on the idea of shipbreaking, of cutting the ships apart to create those debris fields, not just sort of scavenge through them. And as a huge point of reference, we looked at real-world shipbreaking, which is just a bizarre, crazy thing that happens in the world. It's very awe-inspiring, but also when you actually look at it and look at who's doing it and the terrible conditions that they work in and why they're doing it, etc., you start to sort of see the extreme examples of capitalism and labor and the sort of exploitation of working class folks. And that started to really it was hard to sort of look at that reference and not see all those other pieces and want to talk about all those other pieces. So I think it's really when we started to look at shipbreaking as a mechanic and as a role for the player that we started to go, you know what, if we can't really do that without also looking at and talking about labor as a whole and what it means to be sort of a working class laborer. It would be disingenuous to do all of that without also exploring all of that. So that was about maybe a year and a half, 2 years into development.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's super cool to hear. I think, I had a similar experience in the sense of, I also, have been super interested in shipbreaking as a kind of like practice, because it seems to capture so many aspects of kind of contemporary capitalism. It kind of connects to the kind of global dispersed kind of like incoherent structure that you look at, where you've kind of got these ships that have this particular role, and then they're taken to kind of like Chittagong, taken to like India and Pakistan to be broken up in spaces that are unregulated, but the ships themselves are also kind of constructed in highly regulated environments. And there's this kind of weird tension between the two ends of the process, and how it loops round. And for my own part, I think a big part of the inspiration behind Citizen Sleeper was a book called Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Singh.
I've never heard of it.
It's a really interesting book about Matsutake harvesters, so people who collect Matsutake mushrooms. And Matsutake mushrooms are kind of one of the most sought after culinary objects in Japan, and they're kind of served and all over the world, really. They're served at kind of a really high level restaurants, but they only grow in mostly destroyed pine forest usually, because they grow out of decay, and they're mostly harvested by kind of itinerant workers or homeless people or people who are kind of immigrants often, in California especially. And the book is about kind of how this might be the defining aspect of capitalism. When we look at capitalism, it's kind of like we think about a stock exchange or something hyper-functional and kind of efficient. And Anna Singh's point is kind of that capitalism is actually defined by these weird transient systems, the peripheries, these vast peripheries that are like any kind of peripheral element, are way bigger than the central part and take up more of our lives. and cover more people's lives, and those are dysfunctional and kind of strange and interconnected. And that was the kind of big thing that inspired me, is like looking at those structures. And I feel that kind of coming out of Shipbreaker a bit, because there's that interesting element of Shipbreaker where you're at the tail end of a process. You've kind of got, you see little pieces of the world through what comes to you in the ships, and you're kind of involved in like one of the dirty ends of the process where things kind of like fall apart, not in the kind of grand exploration part of the world. So I'm also kind of curious about that aspect of it, I guess, or like the resonance between our two games there.
Yeah, because it seems like Citizen Sleeper sort of shows you a couple different examples of how that plays out, right? You have sort of the commune with the fungal sort of farming, and you've got the shipbreaking, and you've got the people who find data and sell it to the gangs, and all of that. You're saying all of these like peripheral systems that grow and sort of feed back into that one central thing. And for Shipbreaker, we very much just took the one and wanted to explore, okay, like, yeah, what is this is the end of the life cycle for these ships that have, they're not here because they've been destroyed or there's a war or anything like that. It's just, things wear out over time, and eventually you got to get rid of them. And someone somewhere knows how to take that stuff and turn that into money. And so that, that's you get hired to do that, and it's incredibly dangerous and unsafe because it is so far removed from where everyone else is kind of their attention is, right? The government and citizenry and stuff is sort of looking at that central part of capitalism, and this unregulated area is just a free for all, right? Like all kinds of crazy stuff happens there, and so we really wanted to just keep exploring that area and dive into that and put you in that position.
Yeah, I like the way that kind of is like genuinely visually represented in Shipbreaker by the fact that you're in orbit, which is like a literal peripheral unregulated zone, right? You're like, you literally are looking down on the Earth and kind of seeing like, oh, well, that's where like the real stuff happens, and this is me up here in the kind of like side portion. So yeah, it's a really interesting like visual part of it. Was that kind of orbital, the idea that you would be in orbit around Earth, was that also kind of like something that was really important, or it just came in later? Or
yeah, it came in a little bit later, because originally those screenshots that I'd shown to you previously of the space station, the ring station, was actually like, that was set really far away from Earth, a couple of years from Earth, and it was meant to be like a real backwater place, really far removed. But we felt that it was interesting to sort of think about, well, what if you were sort of right next to Earth and you could see all of that, and you could almost we talked a lot about Slumdog Millionaire and how they live in the slums, but they could sort of see into the city and see all of the like wealth and stuff that's happening there, and you just have that class divide just like right next to each other, and that seemed like a really interesting thing. So that's when we sort of decided to bring the station back to Earth. And have you just sort of be in orbit, but you still feel so isolated and removed from everything. But it's almost pronounced by the fact that you can see Earth there. You can see the rail gate that's sending everyone off to like Mars and stuff, and you're like, I want to get on that, but you can't, right? I think that's more powerful. You see that in places like Brazil too, right? With like the favelas that are up on the hill, and then right next to them are these like super guarded communities. It's just a really fascinating contrast, and I think it's you see it all over the place.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think, in Citizen Sleeper, I think one of the things I kind of like wanted to do was set the game really in that like backwater station, right? Like a place far away. And I wanted to have the corporations kind of be like not there, like not right on your back, actually just kind of you're in the echoes of those. But I still wanted that same feeling. I talked to Amos, the composer, about how I wanted the music to evoke that feeling of being in a car, like driving on a motorway or freeway, like outside a city or like through a city, but where you're always seeing kind of lights at a distance, and you're always kind of imagining the things that might be going on, and you're playing that narrative over in your mind. And that was kind of part of the inspiration of like trying to keep that little bit of distance in the game, of you're always on the outside of the space station from the player's perspective in Citizen Sleeper.
That's almost exactly the same direction I gave to the artists when they were designing the railgate station that's meant to look like a bustling sort of airport or port town that you're looking at and going, oh, there's so much life and stuff happening there, but I'm on this, like you're saying, this road sort of overlooking a city in a little valley or something, and you just have all those twinkling lights and stuff. It's so funny. That's exactly the same same direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's perhaps not surprising that there's kind of these things happening, I guess, because in a way, I guess I'm curious if you agree, but I imagine you probably do, but the science fiction that I like to make is I like to think about science fiction as a way of talking about now rather than like a way of necessarily predicting the future. But it's more like, it's extrapolation, but it's often really about that starting point. It's not, it's not a proposal for like, oh, things could be like this, we should be afraid of what happens in the future. It's like, no, we should be paying attention to what's happening now.
Yeah, 100% agreed. I think that's the whole point of science fiction.
And so outside of the kind of shipbreaking aspect, were there kind of other like elements of things that you observed in the world or that the team observed in the world that you felt really came into part of that?
Yeah, it's interesting because when we had started development, started to look at the labor aspect of things. I was looking a lot at history, especially Western history, and things like building of Manhattan and the iron workers and the people that built that, and the history of sort of unions throughout all of Western society. And all of that stuff's kind of infused in there, but the more we started working on this in 2016, and between 2016 and when we launched in early access in 2020, like the world just went crazy. Like the world just went bonkers. And you saw like Amazon really getting in the news as like doing all these horrible labor practices. Unions started to become a thing again, and like Starbucks unions and Amazon unions and Google unions started to sort of crop up. And so that whole world was starting to sort of open up and have these discussions about what labor looks like in today's world. And it just really struck me as an echo of all these things that I was researching through history of the rise of unions in the 20s and the 40s, for example. And it just felt like we were starting to repeat that cycle. And so that for me is what Shipbreaker is a huge part of. A huge part of it is, it's 300 years from now, but it is really just a repetition of this cycle that just seems to keep happening, at least for the last 300 years of history. So it's super infused by everything, not just the shipbreaking.
Yeah, I think that kind of union, the obvious particular kind of having this moment of having unions reemerge as a response to this like period of, very extreme precarity, or at least that's like how I always kind of put it, is like super interesting. I think one of the things that I was, in terms of kind of union structures in Citizen Sleeper, I was kind of trying to deal with this like post-union space where like maybe you've got this kind of how you've got these kind of dysfunctional authorities that can kind of exist, or like there's this complexity that happens. And I think for me, I was also looking a lot at history. Particularly, one thing that I was looking at was kind of my partner's Romanian, and I was looking at the kind of Romanian Revolution and how kind of like power continues or shifts over the course of a revolution. And we often think of kind of revolutions or kind of popularly as like moments of major shift, but actually so many things just kind of carry through, so many logics and so many people even just kind of like hold on to power through a revolution. And so one of the things that I wanted to explore in Citizen Sleeper was having this kind of central union havenage, which had been set up by some people, and then it kind of over time started to decay or started to change. And at the same time, you had kind of structures come in that were just being repeated from corporations elsewhere, right? They were just being inherited, and kind of like those logics were being applied. And I'm curious if in kind of Hardspace, you're very much like under the thumb of Lynx, but there was ever a point where you thought about kind of like stretching that out to like what happens if you're a mum and pop like shipbreaker, right? Like out on some kind of backwater, and you're kind of trying to survive, and you've got to make ends meet, or if that's something that you're kind of like still interested in exploring, or because that's something that I'm super interested in. So that's a very selfish question.
No, I can see that sort of reflected in Citizen Sleeper's gameplay. For us, that's something that I think we are definitely keen to explore. That's sort of what gets set up at the end of Shipbreaker. You sort of get your own ship and you jet away from the station, and it's implied that you're going to go off and do your own thing, and you're no longer working for Lynx. So theoretically, the continuation of that would be you're off sort of building your own independent salvaging operation or whatever, right? And it becomes almost about this journey of as you become the corporation, what does that mean, and how do you try to reflect your personal values in that? And I think what we see in the world is just kind of like, I think what you're sort of hinting at is, at a certain scale, the machinations of capitalism. It doesn't matter what your sort of like intent or what your values or what your personal philosophy is. Companies at a certain scale will just act like companies, right? No matter what the individuals sort of think. And I think it's interesting to explore that, and that's definitely something I'd consider exploring in a future Shipbreaker title. It's stuff we talked about more when we had like the ring station that you were sort of working on.
Yeah.
But yeah, in our case, we really just wanted to focus on the being an exploited worker and what that meant, and how you could sort of reinforce your own sort of value and your own authority within that kind of context.
Yeah, and that's the thing I really fascinates me about about Shipbreaker, and that's one of the first. Yeah, talking about my own game. No, but that really, I think I probably won't be the first person to point out. But that, like, obviously the game is also very, very satisfying in terms of like it like provides work as an interesting practice or a skilled practice, and it's kind 100%. Of has a lot of respect for that. And I think there's some, like, again, it's another really strong point of resonance, I think, between our games, because for Citizen Sleeper, one of the things I was thinking about exploring was also my own experiences of working gig work, and how gig work can be horrible, but it also allows you to meet so many people. And so much of my life where I worked gig work was kind of getting phoned up on a random day and being told I need to turn up at a bar, and then just turning up at a bar for the first time and people being like, "Why are you here?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, the agency called me." But then the people I met through those jobs and the kind of stories I got to hear were incredible, and getting to see all the layers of a city and the way in which I think most people don't necessarily get that privilege. It sounds stupid to call it a privilege, but that kind of experience of like knowing what it's like to finish a shift at 3 a.m. and knowing which bars are open and where, and meeting like people like croupiers and rickshaw drivers in the middle of the night, like living all those different lives and getting to live them just for a short while, so, as an agency worker, was quite influential on me. And I think, and also just on me as a writer in terms of my love of people and their stories. And I feel like I was kind of cherry picking material from that throughout. But I think that's kind of like comes through in Shipbreaker as well really nicely, is that there are people are really important in the game, and they are kind of like, they're really present, and they're very human, and also the work is kind of human in a weird way. It's really about getting your hands dirty, and it's fun.
And it's fun, and you take pride in it in a certain way, even if it is sort of rote and sort of you do it over and over again. And I think it's interesting. One of the things that changed a lot between 2016 and 2020 is the rise of the gig economy and that becoming a big thing. And I think if we had started the game later, we might have rolled some more of that into it. But for me, it comes a lot from my experience. I worked in the loading dock at the Hudson's Bay Company here in Canada for a long time. And Shipbreaker is very much inspired. Like almost all the characters in Shipbreaker are like inspired by people that I worked with there. And that's a super rote job, taking boxes off a truck and putting them in a shelf somewhere, right? But even that sort of basic task, you sort of gain a proficiency in and a pleasure in, and you're almost like dancing as you're sort of organizing these things and solving this logistical puzzle, right? And we took pride in that. This meaningless thing that people shopping at the bay weren't aware of. They didn't really think about us working in the back, stocking stuff. But it was something that we were really proud of, and that's what I really wanted to get across with the gameplay. The fact that you could over time just become a master at it and feel like you enter this flow state with it. And obviously, like we were talking before this call, that some people play it just for relaxation, and I think that that's fantastic, because that's how I feel sometimes when I'm in the midst of a sort of a repetitive labor task. It's super satisfying.
Yeah, especially given that most of us don't work those jobs now, that or maybe even don't have the opportunity to do regular labor. It's kind of something funny, but I have definitely felt that satisfaction in kind of certain jobs that I had. Like, I mean, bartending is a great example of something that's relatively rote and routine, but it can be incredibly satisfying. But it's also driven off the energy of the people around you. It's really such a people job.
It's funny that we were both I also was a bartender for a catering company, so I would also show up at places randomly, and it's funny that we both had that.
I have a special love for kind of food service jobs generally. I think the kind of energy that comes from them is very special and unique. I really loved, I don't know if you've watched the show The Bear.
Oh, yeah. Love it.
Yeah, I love that show so much, and I think that show captures a lot of what I like to capture. And it feels kind of like Shipbreaker also has those vibes. And like what I love in The Bear is all these characters kind of have their own problems and their own stories, and then they're not kind of all linked up neatly with their work. They're kind of independent from the work, but the work is somehow a place that maybe like there can be cross-pollination or something can happen. And I think this is really powerful and important. And I don't know, it's an interesting tension when you're making something that's about how dehumanizing work can be, when you're also recognizing that a workplace is an incredibly valuable piece of social glue
Huge
in society as well.
And I think The Bear shows that a high pressure place like that can be almost like a crucible for those kinds of problems that I say this to people that I work with all the time. Like, I think it's impossible to separate your personal life from your work life. And I think it's foolish to think that we can. And in the Western world, at least, we like to think that we can sort of neatly divide those things. And I think it's something like The Bear or our games as well kind of show like, no, like humanity it's there the whole time. And if anything, a high pressure workplace is going to bring that stuff. It's going to draw that stuff out, and it's going to cause you to have to deal with it and have other people deal with it too. Yeah,
I think that for me is a interesting tension in making this kind of work as well, because it's the kind of central thing that I thought a lot about with Citizen Sleeper is the tension of whether or not being a small cog in a big system meant that you were meaningless, or that it gave you a certain kind of anonymity and agency that meant that it didn't matter about the system you're part of, because you can just deal with the your direct connections. You can make life better for the people you work with, or you can help support people around you or the people in your life. And what does it matter that the system keeps rolling? Because it's going to keep rolling without you or with you. And there's a kind of that strong tension that you can oscillate back and forth between, like, does what I do matter or does it not matter? Is it, and what does mattering mean? Is it something about is it something about affecting the world, or is it something about affecting what's local to me?
So I have a question for you, Gareth.
Yeah.
Like did you set out, you were asking about how Shipbreaker sort of we got to these labor themes. Did you set out with that in mind, or did your game sort of become that over time? What came first for you? Was it the thesis, or was it sort of the mechanics, or?
Yeah, it's a weird hybrid, because I think that a version of this game has been sat in my head ever since I started making games, and in a way a version of this story has been sat into my head before I even realized that I would kind of make games back when I felt more like a writer, and I kind of spent a lot more time thinking about writing novels. And I think just it was just that my experiences of working gig work just left me with so much material, it felt like. And but also, I guess it felt very isolating in a way, because most of the people around me did not have that experience. And there was a period of my time where I kind of later in my career ended up being unemployed, and I had to go back to being a gig worker, and I had to go back to working for agencies. And that was really hard and really felt unfair, and it felt odd to be kind of like set back. And it really affected my view of like how we think about systems of progress, or how we think about like, oh, well, no, you just graduate out of that work. And I during that period, I met a lot of people who would never graduate out of that work, right? I met kind of like, I worked in a museum of childhood, actually, one of the things I worked in during that period. And I worked with a lot of single mothers who would never like necessarily, they didn't necessarily have the capacity to move beyond working in this museum because they didn't have qualifications. They were divorced, and their possibility of gaining new qualifications was low. And so for them, this was not like just something you do as a young person, and then one day you'll be fine. It's like,
no,
no,
this is their career. Yeah,
this is their career, and that was very humbling and affected me a lot, and changed my view of kind of society at that point. So I think a lot of these things had a really big influence on me wanting to tell these kind of stories, and wanting to dig into that material, because I wasn't sure that it was really being told. And then I think my own obsession with science fiction meant that I was like, well, why can't I tell these stories in science fiction? And I think a few pieces of media like galvanized that for me, especially like William Gibson's early work, which is all about kind of like, the lower rungs of society or whatever, trying to make by. Especially like Count Zero, I love, because it's kind of about like a shitty kid in New Jersey who just wants to be a hacker but is not actually a hacker. And I really related to that kind of like growing up in a shitty place and just trying to like do something with yourself. And then also a wonderful game called Diaries of a Spaceport Janitor. Oh yeah, great. Love it. Which I love that game so much, because it just really, when I played that game, I felt so... One of the wonderful things about that game is it has days. Like you go around, pick up it. For people who don't know it, you go around and pick up trash in a spaceport, in a kind of Star Warsy spaceport, cartoony place. And there's days, and one of the days is like a celebration day where everybody goes out and parties, and there's like musicians on the street, and you kind of get to go out and like you're picking up trash on that day. And then the next day, the streets are always covered in trash and empty. And I really loved the way that game captured the kind of rhythms of a city, but from the perspective of somebody who is not allowed to be part of them. It's like you're kind of like, oh, I've got energy today because it's the party day, and the next day you're like picking up the trash from the parties, and you're like, well, I guess like it was nice that it was party day, but it also wasn't my party day. And yeah, I think those things kind of glued in my head this idea that maybe I could make a science fiction story that would be relatable to me and that would explore my own experiences. And so I think then after making In Other Waters, I had the opportunity to make a second video game, which for me was like, okay, I didn't know I would get this chance. So I was just like, okay, I'm going to make this one. I'm going to make the story about me and about, but also try and make it some science fiction, and make it something that kind of like is, I don't know, like enjoyable or satisfying or exciting or filled with variety, and is a place you can go that gives you something, and then you come back to your life. It's not just a kind of like, it's not a brutal mirror that's like, yeah, look how shit the world is, but it actually takes you somewhere else and reflects on things that mean something to you. But yeah, because when I was playing Spaceport Janitor, what I loved was the combination of being in this kind of cool, cartoony, fun spaceport environment, but as a character that I could directly relate to. Totally. And I guess that's kind of, is that part of Shipbreaker? Did you feel like maybe partly driven by that feeling of wanting to have science fiction characters that were more relatable than like a super soldier, or is that not really a...
100%. That's exactly like I said earlier. Like we really, we wanted to sort of show that this work is, you can be proud of this work, and it can be aspirational to be someone in this position. We often think of like aspirational game player roles as being like Master Chief or someone else, like some crazy action hero or whatever. And I think that's there's lots of stuff covering that, so like that's fine, those bases are covered. And B, I think we're sort of missing the beauty and the pride of these other roles that you can have in society and in the world. There's a lot of beauty there. So it's important for me to sort of just drill into that as a thing, and not worry about being a superhero, right? So yeah, huge part of that. Like these roles are important. Cool. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what really excited me the moment that I saw those first trailers, is as someone who loves the kind of homeworld aesthetic and has like a ton of homeworld bits and pieces around, and like art and kind of always just found that. It's just being like, oh, like getting to be a regular person, but in
in that world.
this kind of world is just actually, it just immediately is like, yeah, this is exactly what I want from a video game.
Totally, I find that way more interesting than being, the person in charge of the fleet or whatever, right? Like just being one person, just doing a small task on one of the ships in the homeworld fleet. Like that's way more interesting to me. Yeah.
One,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry. Just one tension that I wanted to talk about that is kind of like curious to me, and especially because I noticed there's like there's Alien RPG like sat behind your head.
Yep.
But it's actually the Alien side of things. I always think there's this thing about, because Alien is I think probably an influence on both of us in terms of like cassette like
cassette
tech and yeah. But one of the things that I always observed that I find a bit tricky with making this kind of work is that like the presence of corporations always seems to draw like a lot of focus and attention, and then somehow almost like fetishization of corporations. And I think like Alien's a great example because you have like Wayland Yutani. Like I think I probably own a Wayland Yutani t-shirt. Yeah. And I think after a few years after owning that t-shirt, I was like, this is really weird to why do I own, why is it that I have a t-shirt of this like corporation, horrible, disgusting corporation, but I'm like advertising them. And I think that happens in a lot of this media, and it was one of the reasons why I kind of pushed the corporations to the distance for me.
Yep.
And it was one of the reasons why, for example, like I tried to avoid having an SNARP, which are the corporation that make the sleepers, tried to avoid having an SNARP logo like in the game, because I was like, I don't want to do their PR for them. I want to try and be in this other space. But then obviously in Shipbreaker, Lynx is like hyper present. And I'm not trying to like call you out and say like that's a bad call, because I don't think it is. I think it's obviously really important for the atmosphere of the game. But I'm just curious if you felt that tension, or if that's something that kind of came through in the game, or...
I think we were definitely aware of that tension, but I think we intentionally kind of lean into it as a way to again reflect kind of just what happens in the real world. Like corporations spend so much time and effort building a cool brand that people resonate with, and all of it is just like they're just pulling our emotional strings, right? Like they're just playing tricks on us. And so we actually, there's lots of places in Shipbreaker where we lean into that and we actually make that part of the story and part of the gameplay. Like some of the rewards you get for salvaging are these cool stickers that Lynx gives you, and Lynx just straight up, you find emails from them just being like, we give them these stickers because it makes them feel like a little bit of a dopamine hit. And like it's a game mechanic, but it's literally framed as the corporation just playing with your like reward centers. And so we just embraced the whole thing, and just if you're really paying attention, you can sort of see that we're kind of like poking holes in that company as like a cool entity sort of mythos, and just saying like no it's all a sham, and like if you fall for it, you should be more aware.
Yeah, I mean, I think the customization is a fun aspect of that as well, in terms of like the tension between kind of commercialism, but also like self-expression that kind of exists in that space. Exactly. And I found that to be really fun. It's like I couldn't figure out when I was playing the game if like covering my like equipment in stickers was like an act of rebellion or an act of compliance. That like it's kind of there's like a funny tension in there.
Even the music, right? The music is like that sort of like working chain gang kind of music, and it's meant to feel like sort of rebellious in a way, but then you find out in the story that it's just they actually are like piping it into your head, like they chose the music and they're giving you that feeling. It's not like the workers chose to play that themselves. It's all fake.
It's super interesting. I don't think I've seen that bit where I don't think I've seen anything in the game about the music being fake. I didn't realize that. That's kind of
hidden in there.
Yeah, that's fun.
I was curious. One of the things I wanted to ask you, you talked about growing up in a shitty place and trying to make something of yourself, and it seems to me like that the implication there was that it's sort of that your upbringing and where you grew up in the world, and that the place that you grew up in is a huge part of what led you to make this game. And it's the same for me. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, which is like the oil center of Canada, right? And it's a very industrial city, and that's sort of what I grew up just surrounded by blue collar industry, before moving to Vancouver, which is way more like the artsy center of Canada, right? So that that was a huge inspiration. Like Calgary is a huge inspiration for Shipbreaker and the aesthetics of Shipbreaker. And I'm curious, where are you from, and how do you think that informed your decisions on Citizen Sleeper?
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting to know. I think that so I grew up in a couple of places. I grew up in the Orkney Islands, just above Scotland, which I think is kind of like a weird and remote place, a kind of nowhere place. But and then later on, I grew up in the Lake District in the UK, which is like a rural area of the UK, which is kind of a funny place because it's kind of famously picturesque. But it, like most famously picturesque places, actually living there is a kind of totally different reality to visiting it. And so it's actually also one of the poorest places in the country, and kind of has a lot of problems because of that. So I think I definitely didn't grow up in environments that felt very like structured. And I think I've always been super interested in I don't know, like weird, like the weird edgelands, or where places where things aren't quite fully like put together, like the things that happen there. And I mean, I come from a fairly like working background. My dad's an engineer, and his dad was a chemical engineer for his whole life, but he was also a saxophonist. And my father is also a photographer. And I think especially on my dad's side, there's kind of this interesting history of, and I think it's a history in the UK as well, and especially involving union theatres and union brass bands and things like this in the UK, but of like working people with creative kind of like lives outside of work, but also not creative lives that were in any way monetized or part of this kind of the way, my creativity or like creativity of my generation feels. And I think that's something that I definitely drew on thinking about the characters in Citizen Sleeper, is thinking about characters who kind of like, as not being defined by their work lives or that kind of like that particular kind of balance of things. But I think the biggest influence on from my background on Citizen Sleeper is really just London. I think
Interesting.
Just moving to London and trying to make life work in London is like what it's like when you start Citizen Sleeper and you have no money and you need medicine and and I mean I live with chronic depression my whole life, and kind of like the feeling of having the table stacked against you, and then also living in a city where you're kind of in that constant feeling of like, you have these incredible moments where you might just, maybe it just rained and you're just walking along a street and you see all the people coming and like cleaning out their shops, or like, like taking the tables out again after it rained and setting them up for people to come have a drink. And for some reason, this is like the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, because it seems to represent like some huge unknowable structure that is like humanity or society just kind of continuing, but at the same time you have that kind of experience, and you're also like you're also walking there because you don't have enough money for the bus, and that's the reason why you see this beautiful vision. Because if actually if you had the money, you'd already be at your shift, and actually you're running late. And like my life in London, early life in London, was always this like tension between being so excited about being in a city and so excited about the people. And I think London's just this insanely diverse city. It's like most people here just like meeting a Londoner in London is rare. Most people in London are from somewhere else, and they have a story why they're here. And they have a story why they're still here as well, and why they've held on, or what helped them, and so that's just all around you all the time. But at the same time, it's a rough city to survive in because it's expensive, and it's only got more expensive, and it's it's inside a country that is hostile to immigrants, despite the fact that London itself is a city built entirely out of immigrants and on immigrants. And it's so there's constantly that tension. And I think that's something that's just really influenced me a huge amount. And I'm continually kind of like playing in that zone when I'm making things, I think.
Well, and what you described there is like Citizen Sleeper just captures all of that in the people that you meet and why they're there and what they're doing to survive and how you're trying to survive. That's wonderful. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really, yeah. I mean, I think that, I don't know. I mean, there is just an endless, I'm sure, you know, obviously Hardspace is motivated by this, but there is just an endless kind of volume of interesting things that you can find by just spending time with people and kind of the lives they lead and the jobs they do. And I think that kind of like, I don't know, like that's something I find very hopeful and very kind of enthusing versus like paying attention to how cruel this system is that hangs over us, is actually like spending time with people in the immediate vicinity or in the structures and kind of seeing like, you know, that was the question I really wanted to ask people in Citizen Sleeper, is like, how do you build a life? Because there's not really like one answer to that question. How do you find a way in the context of this kind of cruelty? I guess like that's kind of where Hardspace like steps back, right? It leaves you at the end of kind of being like, oh, what next? Like you've got out from under part of this system. But yeah, that's where I'm like really excited. I won't ask you to talk about, I know what it's like. I won't ask you to talk about anything you can't talk about, but but that side of things I think is really exciting. That's
what I think is great about your game in particular, is that sense of hopefulness, right? It's sort of inside of all that despair. This is a thing that I sort of criticize dystopia fiction a lot, because I think it just fetishizes the dystopia, or like just uses it as a dressing, and it doesn't interface with it in any meaningful way, and it doesn't provide any sort of example of ways to sort of get past it or like deal with it. And Citizen Sleeper, I think, shows many ways in which you can build a life, build relationships with people, help each other, and build community, and ultimately have a meaningful life within that context, even if, as you're saying, the system continues to roll on. And Shipbreaker is in a similar vein, is saying, no, you can sort of assert your right as an individual in this world and have people listen to you and have the company respect you and be a human being and be valued. You can do that in a corporate dystopia, right? If you're willing to sort of put up the fight. And I think that's great. I think that it's super important for games. This is what I'm interested in as a developer nowadays, is trying to provide messages of hope, or trying to provide meaningful hopefulness to players. Because I think we've just had so much dystopia for so long, and we have so much of it in our daily lives as well. So. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think it's, even though it is about, I think, we all work. We all, it's something we all do, and reflecting that actually in games is super interesting to me. And not reflecting it kind of just like locking people into the same like structures that they have in their daily life, where they work at home and they work in games, but instead like using it as a space for a reflective way of thinking about work, which I think Shipbreaker does really beautifully, because there's so much space for reflection in Shipbreaker. There's so much space while you're working to kind of consider the position you're in, but also to get that kind of satisfaction and relaxation out of it. And so, yeah, I think that's really nice. And I agree that, like, I personally, I mean, I don't know, I'm trying to make a game that's about what it felt like and what it feels like to be in the position I was in. And so it's like, of course, it has to be hopeful, because I have to persist, right? I have to keep going. Exactly.
And so I sometimes feel that dystopian fiction about work is often, in a way, it's made from a position of privilege, because it's made from that position of looking down on people who work, looking down on that kind of, and being like, oh yeah, look how miserable it is to be a slave to a corporation. And it's like, well, actually, we're, you know, and maybe it's a bit of a paradigm shift in kind of stories and games now, is that there's that reinvigorated interest in kind of like cyberpunk, or in kind of like what would typically considered dystopian science fiction, but actually the focus has shifted, and it's not kind of wallowing in this like, oh, look how horrible and how perverse, but instead it's really like latching onto like those little bits of humanity, and it's about reflecting what, you know, our experiences in science fiction. I find that the most exciting thing in science fiction right now is science fiction that's about what it means to be a person now, as opposed to science fiction that's about kind of some lofty prediction.
Yep, which feels like a bit of a return to what I think science fiction was always meant to be about, and I think sort of lost its way a little bit for a little while.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree. I mean, like going back to Gibson, it's like
Yep.
you know, Gibson was he went to Canada, he ran away from the draft. He worked in like head shops selling drug paraphernalia. You know, like all of his characters are clearly drawn from his experiences, right? The only reason he became a writer is because he managed to get a scholarship for an English course at a university, and he didn't have any money or any job at the time. So it's like, well, going to university is going to be my job, and that's how he got into writing. And I think like that's, you know, that really shows in his work. And so I agree. I think like that's it feels right for me, at least for the science fiction I like, that it should tell those stories.
Agreed.
Nice. Well, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Elliot.
Oh, likewise, Gareth.
I've also got to ask like a few of my like fan questions, which was very pleasant, and I'm super excited for whatever the future of Hardspace is. And yeah, thank you for talking with me about.
Oh, thank you. This was so much fun. Again, just discovering even more parallels between our work has been so awesome. Thank you for having me. It was great.
Cool. And now it's a race to see who can copy each other first. Like who's going to
drop a trailer first. Yeah. Amazing. Thanks, Gareth. I think it all worked out in the end.
Yeah. Exactly.